Everyone thought the gorilla was about to attack. The enclosure gate had just opened for a controlled check, and the old caretaker had only stepped inside a few feet when the silverback turned toward him. Not slowly, not lazily, with the kind of deliberate full-body turn that makes every trained keeper in the room hold their breath. The crowd behind the observation barrier went completely silent. One keeper pressed her radio to her lips and whispered something. Another moved 2 steps closer to the safety latch without taking her eyes off the animal, because when a silverback weighing close to 400 pounds locks onto a person and starts moving, there is no such thing as a small mistake. There is only what you do in the next 3 seconds. And the gorilla was moving now, slowly, directly, straight toward the man standing near the gate. The man did not run. He did not raise his hands. He did not back toward the exit the way every instinct in his body was probably telling him to. He stood there, weight low, arms loose at his sides, and let the animal come. That detail alone stopped one of the senior keepers cold. Because a person who panics in that moment does not stand still. Only someone who has spent years around animals this powerful knows that stillness is the only language that matters right now. Because the gorilla was still coming. 3 steps. 4. Close enough now that the people behind the barrier could hear him breathing. Deep, rhythmic pulls of air through wide nostrils, not the short, sharp breath of aggression. Something else, something slower. And then just a few feet away from the man, the silverback stopped. He stood there, still as stone, and the look in his eyes changed. Was this danger, or was it something nobody in that room had prepared for? The man's name is Daniel Mercer. He is not a showman. He is not a wildlife celebrity, or a conservation influencer with a camera crew following him around. He is a former wildlife caretaker, 61 years old, with calloused hands and a quiet way of moving that most people who work around large animals eventually develop without realizing it. The kind of stillness that comes not from fearlessness, but from understanding exactly how much can go wrong. Daniel had not been inside this sanctuary in 8 years. He had not seen this gorilla in 8 years. He had driven 4 hours that morning after receiving a careful, measured phone call from the sanctuary's animal welfare director. The call had not been emotional, it had been clinical. They had noticed behavioral changes in the silverback over the past several months. Withdrawal, restlessness, a pattern of returning repeatedly to a specific corner of the enclosure near the old service gate, an area he had no functional reason to visit. They had ruled out illness, they had ruled out social conflict within the group, and then almost reluctantly the director had mentioned Daniel's name to the head keeper, who had gone very quiet for a moment before saying, "That might be worth a conversation." Daniel had not promised anything when he agreed to come. He had not told anyone that the gorilla would remember him. He is not the kind of person who makes promises about animals. He had simply said he would come, follow the protocols, and see what happened. And so here he is, inside an enclosure that smells like wet earth and hay, and the thick musky scent of a dominant male who has ruled this space for years. His boots are the same kind he always wore. His jacket is older but familiar in the way that worn things carry scent. The sanctuary team had actually asked him about that before he went in. What he was wearing, what soap he had used, whether anything had changed dramatically about his daily routine in a way that might alter how he smelled. Daniel had found that question oddly moving, because it told him the team understood something important, that for an animal like this, memory does not live in the face, it lives in the nose. He had followed every instruction, no sudden movement, no reaching forward, no raising his voice above a calm conversational tone. He had entered through the service gate with 2 experienced keepers flanking him at a respectful distance, and he had simply stood there and let the gorilla decide what happened next. He had not called out the animal's name, not yet. He had just let himself be present. A familiar shape, a familiar smell, a familiar way of being still in a space, and the gorilla had turned. The silverback is not moving anymore. He is standing close enough that Daniel can see the individual hairs on his broad forearm, silver-tipped and coarse, catching the afternoon light coming through the overhead panels. His face is unreadable to most people. Wide-set eyes beneath a heavy brow, a jaw that could crack bone without effort, a chest so deep and broad that his breathing visibly moves his entire upper body. But Daniel is watching the small things, the set of the shoulders, the position of the hands, the angle of the head, and what he sees is not aggression. It is not the forward lean of a threatened male preparing to charge. It is something harder to define, something between caution and curiosity. The posture of an animal that has encountered something unexpected and has not yet decided what it means. The gorilla lowers his head slightly and breathes in through his nose, a long, deliberate inhale, then another. Daniel does not move, and then quietly, In a voice low enough that the keepers near the gate could barely hear it, Daniel says one word. A name. The name this gorilla has not heard from him in 8 years. The silverback goes completely still. His eyes shift, not away, directly at Daniel's face. The way an animal looks when something has moved from the category of unknown into something older and deeper. Something that does not belong to the present moment at all, but to a different time entirely. The senior keeper watching from the gate later said she had seen thousands of interactions between animals and caregivers in her career. She had seen recognition before. She had seen animals respond to familiar voices, familiar routines, familiar scents, but she said something about the way this animal went still in that moment was different. It was not the stillness of confusion. It was not the pause before aggression. Daniel slowly raises one hand, palm open, fingers loose. The same quiet gesture he used during feeding checks years ago when he wanted to show the animal that nothing in his hand was a threat. A gesture so practiced and so specific that it belonged to a routine that only the two of them had ever shared. The gorilla looks at the hand, then back at Daniel's face, then at the hand again. For one long second, nobody inside or behind that enclosure makes a sound. The only noise is the low mechanical hum of the ventilation system and the distant call of something in the far habitat. The keepers at the gate are not breathing. The animal welfare director, watching through the observation window, has pressed one hand flat against the glass without realizing she has done it, and then the silverback reaches forward. One enormous hand moving slowly through the air toward the open palm of the man standing in front of him. Every keeper in that enclosure freezes. 8 years is a long time to carry something. Long enough for a sanctuary to build 2 new enclosures and hire an entirely different generation of keepers. Long enough for the trees along the eastern fence line to grow thick enough to cast real shade. Long enough for a young, frightened gorilla to grow into the dominant silverback now standing in the middle of that enclosure with his hand reaching toward a man he has not seen since he was barely more than a juvenile. But before any of that happened, there was a beginning, and the beginning was not beautiful. The gorilla arrived at the sanctuary on a Tuesday morning in late October, 8 years ago, in the back of a climate-controlled transport vehicle that smelled like disinfectant and stress. He was 7 years old, underweight for his age. A deep laceration ran along his left shoulder from an injury nobody could fully explain, though the team had their suspicions about how it happened. His eyes were wide and dark and constantly moving, tracking every person, every sound, every shift of shadow in the holding area, like an animal that had learned very recently that the world was not safe. His name was Kano. The sanctuary team had chosen it before he arrived, pulling it from a regional language as they often did with animals rescued from that part of the continent. It was a small thing, a practical thing, but names matter in care routines. You need something to say when you are trying to reach an animal across a distance, something short and soft that carries in the air without startling. The problem was that Kano did not respond to anything in those first weeks. He did not eat well. He did not engage with enrichment materials left in his space. He pressed himself into corners and watched the door. When keepers entered for health checks, his breathing changed immediately, shoulders rising, weight shifting back, every muscle in his young body preparing for something bad to happen. The team documented everything carefully and adjusted their approach constantly, but progress was slow and fragile. Some days it felt like they were starting over entirely. Daniel Mercer was not supposed to be Kano's primary caretaker. He had been assigned to a different section of the facility that season, working with 2 older females who were in the middle of a slow social reintegration. But one afternoon, a scheduling conflict left Kano's afternoon care shift short-staffed, and Daniel was asked to cover. He walked over, read the care notes, and spent about 20 minutes standing quietly outside the holding area before he did anything at all. The keeper who had briefed him later said she expected him to ask questions. Most people ask questions. Daniel just stood there reading the animal's body language like he was reading a page, and then he nodded once and said, "All right, I'll come back tomorrow morning." She asked him what he was going to do. He said probably nothing. Just be there for a while. That was how it started. Not with a breakthrough, not with a dramatic moment of connection. Just a man sitting on an overturned crate outside a mesh barrier, early in the morning before the rest of the staff had arrived, eating his breakfast, and not asking the animal inside to do anything at all. Kano ignored him for 3 days. On the 4th day, he moved about 4 feet closer to the barrier before settling down again. Daniel noticed but did not react. He kept eating his breakfast. He spoke occasionally in a low, even voice, not commands, not coaxing, just the kind of quiet narration that some experienced keepers use almost unconsciously, describing what he was doing, what he was going to do next, filling the air with a voice that meant nothing threatening, that asked nothing, that simply existed in the space alongside the animal. On the sixth morning, Daniel left a piece of papaya near the base of the barrier and walked back to his crate. He turned slightly away, not completely, just enough to remove the direct eye contact that can feel like pressure to an animal still deciding whether a person is safe, and he waited. 2. Konochi waited longer. Almost 20 minutes passed before the young gorilla moved close enough to reach the fruit. He did it in stages, a few steps, a stop, listening, watching, then a few steps more. When he finally took the papaya, he moved back immediately to the far wall and ate it there, watching Daniel the entire time. Daniel did not turn around. He did not make a sound. He just sat there and let the moment be exactly what it was: small, quiet, unremarkable to anyone who had not been sitting there for 6 days waiting for it. That was the first real thing that passed between them. Over the following months, the routine built itself the way routines do when you are patient enough to let the animal set the pace. Kono learned Daniel's footsteps before he learned his face. He could identify the specific sound of Daniel's boots on the concrete corridor long before the door opened, and the keepers began to notice that his body language shifted differently depending on who was coming. With most staff, he remained watchful and guarded. Professional, one keeper joked, like a difficult coworker who tolerates you but does not trust you. With Daniel, it was different, not immediately, not dramatically, but over time the watchfulness softened into something closer to attention. Kano began positioning himself near the barrier when Daniel arrived for morning care. He would sit close, not touching, and observe the routine with an interest that felt less like vigilance and more like participation. He started accepting food directly from Daniel's hand through the protected contact mesh, which was a significant step that the team documented carefully and did not rush. There were always setbacks. A loud noise one morning sent Kano back to the corner for 4 days. A temporary change in Daniel's schedule disrupted the routine badly enough that the team had to rebuild trust from an earlier stage. That is the nature of this work. You do not own the progress you make with an animal like this. You hold it carefully, and you understand that it can shift, and you start again without frustration when it does. But the bond was real, and it was specific. The sanctuary's behavioral records from that period note repeatedly that Kano's stress indicators were measurably lower during Daniel's care shifts than during any other routine interaction. His eating improved, his engagement with enrichment materials increased. He began initiating proximity rather than simply tolerating it. But was not tame. He was never tame. He was a gorilla, young and still growing into his strength, with instincts and a will entirely his own. But something in Daniel's consistent, unhurried presence had given Kano a category for him that nothing else in his short, difficult life had provided. Safe, not performing safety, not offering safety as a transaction, simply being, day after day, the one thing in Kano's world that did not ask for more than he was ready to give. Then Daniel had to leave. It was not a decision he made. A serious illness in his family required him to return home, and the timing of that coincided with a broader staffing restructure that resulted in his permanent transfer to a facility 3 states away. The sanctuary handled the transition carefully. They briefed the incoming keeper thoroughly. They documented everything Daniel had built with Kano in detail: the routines, the preferred approach distances, the vocal cues, the specific enrichment items he responded to best. But documentation is not a person, and a file cannot sit quietly on a crate at 6 in the morning and simply be present. Daniel's last shift with Kano was ordinary on purpose. He did not make it a goodbye. He had thought about it, and he had decided that a disrupted final interaction full of human emotion would serve no one, least of all the animal. So he came in at his usual time, completed the usual checks, placed food down in the usual way, and spoke in the usual low voice. Before he left, he said Kano's name once. Then he walked out. Kano watched him go from the back of the enclosure, stood there watching the door for a long time after it closed, according to the keeper who was monitoring that morning. Then eventually he moved away and went about his day. Daniel had told himself that was the right outcome, that a clean, undramatic departure was better for the animal, that Kano would adjust to the new keeper in time, that the bond they had built had done its job, which was never to be permanent, but to give a frightened young gorilla a foundation to stand on. He had told himself the gorilla would forget him eventually, that it was better that way. But 8 years later, when the sanctuary called, the animal welfare director mentioned something quietly before she even explained why she was reaching out. In the past several months, Kano had developed a habit. Every afternoon, usually in the last hour of light before the evening feeding, he would leave whatever he was doing and walk to the far northwestern corner of the enclosure. The old corner, the one closest to the service corridor where early morning care shifts used to enter. He would sit there and wait for someone who had not come in 8 years. Back in the enclosure, Kano's hand is still moving through the air toward Daniel's open palm. Nobody speaks. The two keepers near the gate have not moved in almost 30 seconds. The animal welfare director is still pressed against the observation glass. The only sound is that low ventilation hum and the slow deliberate breathing of a 400-pound silverback, deciding something that no protocol in any sanctuary manual has ever been able to predict. Kronos' fingers make contact, not grabbing, not gripping. The lightest possible touch against Daniel's palm, the way you might press your hand against a surface to test its temperature. Careful, exploratory. Like the animal is confirming something his nose already told him but that his body needs to verify on its own terms. Daniel does not close his hand. He lets Kano's fingers rest there and does not move a single muscle. Then Kano shifts his weight forward slightly and presses his hand more firmly against Daniel's shoulder. Not aggressive, not playful. The gesture has a quality to it that one of the senior keepers would later struggle to describe in her incident report, finally settling on the word deliberate. Like he was checking something, like he needed the solidity of it. The realness of a person he had filed away somewhere deep and had not been able to retrieve until this exact moment. Daniel's eyes fill. He does not blink them clear. He just stays still and lets it happen, and keeps his breathing even. He says Kano's name again, quietly, the same tone as before. Kano goes very still at the sound of it. Then he does something that makes the animal welfare director pull her hand away from the glass and cover her mouth. The silverback leans forward and rests his forehead lightly against Daniel's shoulder. Not a collision, not a dominance gesture. Something slower and more considered than either of those things. He holds it there for several seconds, this enormous animal with the power to do catastrophic damage, resting his head against the shoulder of a 61-year-old man standing completely still in the middle of an enclosure. And the sanctuary team watches in total silence because none of them want to be the one who breaks it. Daniel raises one hand slowly and places it against Kano's upper arm. Not an embrace, not the kind of contact you would have with a pet or a person. Just a firm, calm pressure against the animal's arm. Present, familiar, the same quality of touch he had used during health checks years ago, when Kano was young and frightened and learning what safe felt like. Kano does not pull away. He shifts his weight slightly and brings one arm around Daniel's back. Loosely, the way the gesture was always going to happen if it happened at all, on the animal's terms, at the animal's pace, meaning exactly what the animal needed it to mean, and nothing more than that. Nobody in the enclosure moves, and then a metal cart shifts loudly in the service corridor beyond the far gate. Kano's head comes up immediately, his shoulders rise, his arm withdraws. The softness of the last 2 minutes compresses back into the body of a dominant male, who has heard something unexpected and is now assessing it with every sense he has. Daniel steps back without hesitating. He does not try to hold the moment. He already knows better than that. The noise does not last long. A keeper in the service corridor realizes what has happened and goes completely still. Someone else quietly moves the cart back against the wall. The sounds stop within seconds, but Kano is already standing differently. Shoulders higher, weight forward, eyes fixed on the far gate with the focused, unblinking attention of an animal that has spent its entire life understanding that the difference between safe and dangerous can arrive without warning. Daniel does not speak. He takes one more slow step back and lowers his body slightly, reducing his profile, giving Kano more space and a clearer sightline to whatever he needs to assess. It is not a retreat driven by fear. It is a deliberate, practiced response from someone who understands that affection does not suspend instinct. That the same animal who rested his forehead against your shoulder 30 seconds ago is also capable of something entirely different if the wrong combination of stimuli arrives at the wrong moment. This is what people who have never worked with animals this powerful do not understand. The tenderness and the danger are not opposites. They live in the same body at the same time. The keepers near the gate reduce their movement to nothing. The ventilation hum fills the silence. Kano holds his posture for almost a full minute, reading the space, reading the air, reading every signal the environment is sending him. Then gradually, his shoulders begin to drop, his breathing slows back down, his eyes lose that hard fixed quality and soften into something more like ordinary alertness. He does not return to Daniel, but he does not move away either. He simply stands in the middle of the enclosure and lets the moment pass, which is its own kind of resolution. Daniel watches him for a moment longer, then looks toward the gate and gives a small, quiet nod. The senior keeper releases a breath she has been holding for 90 seconds and begins the careful process of ending the visit the same way it began. Slowly, without drama, without anything that could read as abrupt or threatening. Afterward, in the briefing room, the animal welfare director is measured and precise in the way that good sanctuary professionals always are, when something significant has just happened. She does not use words like miracle or magic. She talks about behavioral indicators and stress responses and the documented evidence of long-term associative memory in great apes. She talks about what the visit confirmed and what it did not confirm and what the appropriate path forward looks like. Daniel is allowed occasional supervised visits, scheduled carefully, spaced out. No crowds, no observers beyond essential staff, no recording equipment inside the enclosure. The visits are not for Daniel. They are not for the sanctuary's social media presence or its donor communications. They are evaluated purely on the basis of whether they benefit Kano, and if that calculus ever changes, the visits stop. He had not come here expecting access. He had not come expecting anything. He had driven 4 hours because someone who knew animals well had called him and described a gorilla sitting alone in a corner every afternoon waiting for something, and Daniel had understood immediately what that meant, and he had come. That is the thing about the people who do this work well. They do not love animals in the way that makes good television. They love them in the quieter, harder way that understands a animal's well-being does not always include you, that sometimes the most important thing you can offer is your absence. That real care has boundaries not because it is limited, but because it is honest. Before Daniel leaves the facility that evening, he asks if he can stand near the outer fence for a few minutes. The senior keeper walks him over. Kano is across the enclosure, unhurried, moving through his late afternoon routine the way he always does. He stops near the eastern tree line and sits, pulls at something in the grass, looks up at the sky for a moment with that particular expression that gorillas sometimes have, unreadable and ancient and entirely their own. Then he turns his head. He looks directly at Daniel standing at the outer fence. He holds it for a long moment, not tense, not expectant, just looking, in the way that animals sometimes look at things that belong to an older part of their experience, things that do not fit neatly into the present but have not disappeared either. Daniel raises one hand, palm open, the same gesture as always. Kano lowers his head slightly. Then he looks away and goes back to what he was doing. No performance, no dramatic farewell, just a gorilla returning to his afternoon and a man standing at a fence understanding that this is exactly the right ending, that the animal is safe and settled and does not need anything from him right now, and that there is nothing better he could have hoped for when he drove 4 hours this morning not knowing what he would find. Everyone in that enclosure had expected danger. What they witnessed instead was something rarer and harder to name, the proof that a bond built on patience and consistency and genuine respect can survive 8 years of silence. That memory in a living creature does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits in a corner by an old gate, day after day, in the last hour of light, and sometimes the person it has been waiting for finally comes back.